a conductive wire, and you were so electric. I had no say when you came so near, and just passed right through me.
Hey everyone, welcome to Geekdom is back. Today I am joined by a brand new guest, Jenn Nguyen, and we are talking all about the first season of Netflix's new series, Locke Key, and it is based on a comic book series written by Joe Hill. Jenn has read more of them than I have, so we won't be talking about the comics too terribly much in this, but Jenn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing okay, considering that it's been a little bit crazy with this whole coronavirus thing that's happening. But, interestingly enough, I was just thinking about, how the kids in Lock and Key, how they're just like running around on this like almost like scavenger hunt of finding all the keys in the house. It's like, oh man, I need to have a way to distract myself, like just staying home. And stuff too. So it's kind of like, oh, it's so relatable right now.
Unfortunately, not all of us have a house and property the size of the Locke family, so we can't necessarily do scavenger hunts, but we can.
I know.
We can figure out some things to keep us entertained.
Yeah.
It's funny that you mentioned the whole scavenger hunt thing too, because I think that's where Bodhi really comes into play story-wise, because he is the youngest of the characters. You have Bodhi, Kinsey, Tyler, and then their mother, Nina, who live in the house along with Dodge, who is living in the well, and nobody believes Bodhi at first.
Yeah.
So you have this sort of innocence about Bodhi, and he's just so excited about everything. And while most kids aren't necessarily excited about changing and going to a new school and things like that, he's just excited that there's so many interesting things in the house, and he can kind of just isolate himself and do his own thing. He doesn't have to go out and have a ton of friends, and you can tell that Tyler is sort of the one that has the easiest time adjusting as far as on the front of making friends. So just the three siblings alone, there's a lot going on there. So they each have different dynamics with each other and then the people that they meet. And with the mom, I would say most of them sort of have the same dynamic with her, because they kind of know that she's going through the same thing they are, just in a different way.
Yeah. Yeah. I thought it was really fascinating and very interesting how, the very first episode, it just showed all four characters in the car and just the way that they're essentially like dealing with moving to a completely different like place, uprooting themselves from a place of like what used to be great memories built, but it became like a place of like trauma and just tragedy, right? Like in the car, you see Bodhi just like looking through his photography, and then for his older brother, he's just listening to like his earbuds or listening to music and just not really engaging. It's very interesting to me that all three kids had their own way of just being creative or just like distracting themselves. Whereas the mom was just like, okay, I just need to drive and just focus on the road. And then later on in the story, like what you're mentioning, like how all three kids, like they have all different like personalities.
Mm-hmm.
Once they were able to get the head key, we got to see a glimpse of like their personality and just like how they deal with the trauma, right? Like with Bodhi, like you said, like everything is like bright and colorful. Like it's like, what was it? I believe he opened up like a toy chest. And then when he got inside, it was like an arcade and everything was bright and fun. And like as little kids, should be. It's like everything is just so fun. You can like spend hours just like playing Legos or see everything so brightly colored and great for him. And then, later on, when you compare that to like Kinsey, hers was just like, oh man, it was like a mall, which makes sense because like her age group.
Yeah.
But it was just so huge. And then you see like weird stuff for like the elevator, the escalator going to different directions. So even though she herself might be very organized and maybe the way that she thinks or like how her personality is, there's still a lot of chaos in there. And, there's so many like small details too, especially when she walked in and then she sees a map. It's like, this is your own head, but you need a map just to navigate through. You know what I mean? It's like, maybe there's sometimes like for people like her, or even for us, it's like, we might have like information overload, or you feel or think so many things at once, but it's like all over the place, but it's also organized in a very chaotic way. So I really like the fact that with Lock and Key, there's a lot of beautiful visuals that they pull from the book. And because that was one thing that I was very interested in figuring out was how are you gonna show us going into your head, So I thought the visuals and just like the cinematography was really great. And I just love that you see all their different personalities, and like it's almost like a glimpse inside, and how she found her fear eventually later on, and she tried to like get rid of it. So it's like, at least for me, I just love all the direct, oh, this is what it is. Like literally, she like took her fear out, but it's also all the metaphors, of like what we can take away from this TV show. Where I feel like, I'm sure we all have gone through like tough times in our lives. Maybe like to the extreme of what these kids have gone through, but even like just the small things, right? Like, or not small, not trying to minimize people's like traumas or issues, but even with bullying, or being scared of like being able to fit in, because as we see, Tyler had a very easy time when it came to like his transition into a new town, a new school. The fact that everybody knows their story, like, and how to deal with that of having this limelight as children and not really knowing how to navigate that. Whereas for Kinsey, she just, she wants her own space and she's a little bit more introverted. So I like that it has a little bit of everything for each person. And it just shows, the TV show, without directly drilling it into your head or being so blatant about it, it shows that like everybody has their own way of coping and dealing with trauma. And there's no right or wrong way. It's all different for everybody. And I think with that, it's very relatable to any of us viewers. I thought they did a great job of doing that, especially with the dynamic with the mom and the kids and stuff too. For me, at least, I thought it was well done.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I found interesting was the fact that we see Kinsey and Tyler at school a ton throughout this first season, but we only really get one scene of Bodhi at school. And I think that kind of goes to show that he's not someone who is really trying to focus on the school front, because he's so focused on these keys and finding them now. And you have that moment where, he gets in trouble at school and Nina goes to pick him up and she's like, you cannot do this. You cannot bring weapons in your backpack to school. And it's something that, while funny in the context of the show, it's a very serious thing that we've seen happen in real life. And so when you have that one scene, you're like, okay, you kind of get an understanding of how Bodhi is and how school isn't really important to his life right now. But because Kinsey and Tyler are in high school, that's a whole different dynamic, changing schools at that age. So because Tyler's on the hockey team for at least a little bit, it's easier for him to transition. But Kinsey's sort of the loner outsider. And yes, everyone knows their story, but she's sort of, like you said, more introverted about it. And it really makes it harder for her. So when she does find the group of kids that are really like trying to be the Tom Savinis of the world with their makeup effects and, gore effects, it's one of those things where you're like, okay, I understand each of these characters and why we see them in these certain settings. And with Nina, you kind of just have her fixing up the house, trying to get back into what she used to do, which seemed to be interior design kind of stuff, creating these spaces for people. And it's one of those things where the core cast, I think they nailed it. And I also have to mention that Bodhi is also Georgie from the It remake. So there's your Joe Hill, Stephen King connection there. And, we can't talk about the cast without talking about some of the cameos. I already mentioned Tom Savini, who pops up as, the locksmith key guy in this, which I thought was a very nice touch. And you caught this other one, and I totally did not catch it. You noticed that Joe and Gabriel, the creators of the comic, were in this as paramedics.
Yeah. I at that point, I actually screamed at the TV, because it's funny because I've been such a Joe Hill fan, Gabriel Rodriguez fan for so long now. It's like I can spot them out in a crowd.
Well, it helps that Joe Hill looks a lot like his father too.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's like I have this weird obsession of just like wanting to meet him. And I actually got to meet Joe Hill just this past year at San Diego Comic Con. After reading the graphic novels and seeing the artwork, how detailed and intricate it is, I wasn't surprised to watch the Netflix TV show and to see all the little small details that they included in the TV show as well. Like, just from the diversity of how people cope with trauma, but then the small things, like one of the scenes, I believe it was from the very first episode. It was when Bodhi was staring down into the well. I don't know if anybody else caught this, but there was an upshot of a
like an aerial shot of it.
It was a view from as if you were standing in the well, looking up at Bodhi's face. Right on top of it, there was the very peak of the well, and there's a rope that comes down. It actually looks like a key.
Okay.
So I picked up on like these small little things, right? Where for me it was like, wait, was this intentional, or am I like reading too much into this? But the fact that I think most likely they did these small things on purpose, and I just totally appreciated that. So for anybody out there that has not read the graphic novels, I do highly recommend, because at least for me, I feel like they did a great job of like picking up all the details, but in different ways within the TV show.
It's hard too when you're adapting a comic book, because with comics, the artist can literally draw anything on the page, no matter how unrealistic. But then when you literally have to bring it to life, even with things like CGI now, there are still certain limitations with TV and film that you can't necessarily do exactly like they have done them in the comics. And just from the little that I did read from the comics, I was like, okay, they nailed the house and the feel of the area, the small town vibe and everything. And the setting made a huge impact on the story visually, I think, because every time you get a shot of that house, you're just like, wow, that is insanely large, even for 4 people to be in. And so then when you see Bodhi running around inside and you get into the story of the house a lot more, and that hidden room that Nina and Ellie, who was a friend of her husband's from back in the day, uncover, you're just like, does this house ever end? And then you have things like the well house, and you have all of the property, you have like the graveyard. There's just so much to it that I think it really just helps bolster the story of not only the lore with Dodge and everything that's going on, but just the family history as well.
Yeah, I really love that house like that you mentioned, because to me, it also kind of, it made me think of like, oh man, this is like a haunted house. And just like all the little things that just reminds me of like why I love the horror genre so much. Like, I like their like almost like little small nods, like one of the keys where they're looking at each other, like the reflection, and how it's like their version of themselves, but very evil or creepy. And how many stories did we grow up with where it's like, oh, don't look in the mirror, don't say certain names, or stuff like that. I thought it was just very fun, like how they tied all these like little things in with, and as we mentioned before, having Bodhi be the one child, the youngest one, to be like, hey, like I hear these voices, or like there's somebody in the well, and nobody believes him until like they see it for themselves. And even when, I'm kind of jumping all over, but even when their mom was stuck in that little mirror maze thing, and when they got her out of there, she just lost all memory of what just happened.
Oh,
because, and the kids were like, oh, it's because you're an adult. So just seeing how big that house is just like, it's so beautiful, it's so historical, and it's also like lightweight creepy. And how the keys are whispering to each other, it's just like there's so much more, at least to me, just watching it, where I'm like, oh man, like this is making me think about this movie, this is making me think about this and that. And they did make some changes from the graphic novel, and I think I'm okay with it, because right, because like they, of course, with adaptations too, you want to make it relatable and with the times and all of that. But one of the things that I thought was kind of cool, because at first I was like, wait, am I okay with this or whatever? Because it's like, what is it? Their town of Matheson, right? But in the graphic novel, it's actually Lovecraft.
Right.
And I believe it was a nod to like H.P. Lovecraft. So it's like, again, it's like all these small little things. It's like, as much as Bodhi is running around in that house on his scavenger hunt, viewer, I felt like we were on our own journey, on our own scavenger hunt of like, oh, is that a nod to this? Or like, is that a nod to that? It just makes it even extra exciting as we're watching it too, as we start to like piece things together in our own mind. So I just thought like overall, it was a really fun journey.
I'm glad that you brought up how Nina sort of forgot what happened in the mirror. And it wasn't until she started drinking and she was a little more inhibited and her mind was a little more open that she was starting to remember and retain these magical things that were happening, because she found, the wardrobe that fixed things. And she finally started to believe, because she was drinking at that time pretty heavily. You could see all of her stashes throughout the house. And the older kids knew almost right away, just because, they're not dumb and they could smell it. With Bodhi, he was kind of off doing his own thing, so he didn't notice quite as much of it. But I thought that was a good way to sort of take that horror trope and twist it on its head a little and be like, okay, she's going to forget, but we're going to have a moment where we let her remember and she'll start to believe what her kids are telling her.
I keep spinning this with like the whole mental health thing, but that's also something that I'm very passionate about. It's so interesting, right? Because it's like a double whammy. It's like, on one hand, it's what you were just saying about how now she's starting to remember, but that's like her own way of like trying to bury like maybe her emotions, her memories, but it comes to surface, right? But then when we look at Kinsey, when she went back to kill her fear, even though she thought she was successful, and she was for a while, her hair, her attitude kind of changed a little bit too. And she was a lot more confident without having the insecurities, without having, these other thoughts of like being scared of what to say or what to do or how she's doing it. However, no matter how much you do that, where you try to bury, like literally, she tried to bury her fear.
Yeah.
It did come back, like later on in the show, we see her fear come back. And if anything, it came back in full force. So it was great because they didn't like shove it in your face with like all these metaphors and things. They did it in a way where, at least for me, like I caught it, as I watched it. Like I actually watched it like 2 times. and in the second time when I watched it, that's like how you deal with things. She did it to the extreme of like, I'm going to go in and remove something, or at least to try to bury it. But no matter what, it will always come back to the surface. And it kind of just speaks to like how we deal with things. As you mentioned too, how she was able to eventually find her core group of people. They ended up becoming a somewhat support system. But then actually, I take that back. It was like when her and her brother wasn't talking as much, it wasn't so great. But then later on, when the kids actually banded together, they believed Bodhi, they ended up, working together and becoming each other's support system. That was when you can see like them working better together, and they were able to like overcome a lot of things, especially towards the end of the TV show when they were just trying to figure out ways and strategy of just trying to like deal with Dodge and with what's his name? I believe is it Sam, or it was the kid that murdered their father. So I thought that was very interesting too, where it's like just small things like that. And, I've been hearing some things too about how some people, they're not so big on the fact that, the adaptation from the comic book was actually, in my opinion, a bit darker than the TV show. But at least for me, with like these 3 kids, the way that they're dealing with like their trauma and just stuff like that, I thought they did a great job. It almost felt like Stephen King's It, where like all of these kids band together to like figure things out because the adults aren't really helping right now, and it actually kind of like had like the Stranger Things vibe to it as well. So I love that even though it wasn't a complete pull from the comic book, they did it in a way that was very subtle when it comes to like these mental health, trauma themes without making it so heavy. And it was still very entertaining, and it's great for all types of audience. Like for me, as I guess, what am I like? Am I an adult, or even just like younger kids that are like in high school? For them to be able to relate of like transitions, and if you're as young as Bodhi, or you're going into high school, or like whatever, or for the mom, I love that it's a little bit of everything for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we can't talk about this show without really diving into the keys some more. So, I want to just quickly run through what episodes what keys were found in. So, in the first episode, the Anywhere key and the Mirror key were both found, but Bodhi quickly loses the Anywhere key to Echo at the time, who is Dodge and then Lucas. There's so many twists and turns in this. It's a little crazy at times, but then the head key is found in the second episode, and we already talked about that one quite a bit, so we don't need to dive into that one too much more, but it's an interesting key nonetheless. In episode 3, they find the matchstick key. Episode 4, the ghost key. Episode 5, the puppet key and the tree key. You have the mending key in episode 6. Nothing in episode 7, because obviously finding 2 keys in multiple episodes, you're going to have some where they just kind of have to do their own thing. In episode 8, you get the identity key and the omega key, which is big, obviously. So
Yeah.
then you have episode 9 with the echo key and shadow key. And episode 10, there are no keys again, because by then they've found all of the keys, and that sort of culminates in this big final moment that they're all experiencing in the finale. So once this happens at the end in the finale and they have all the keys, you're kind of like, okay, is this a show that's going to continue? And they do kind of this thing where they give you the ending you're wanting by the end of this, but at the same time, you're kind of like, okay, is this just going to be a one season limited series type thing, or are they going to build on it from the comics? And since I haven't read all of the comics, I don't know what exactly happens at the end of those, or if, Joe and Gabriel are still working on more comics for it, because it did seem like it kind of had a sporadic release schedule, if I'm not mistaken, because I think with some comics, especially if it's not Marvel or DC, they don't necessarily come out like every other week or every single month. So it takes a little longer sometimes for these more indie comics to come out. And since I haven't read all of them, I'm kind of like, okay, I want more, but I don't know what they're going to do, because obviously with the keys, you sort of have endless possibilities too, especially with, the Anywhere key, where you can go and do this thing where you show up at the Eiffel Tower just by walking through a door and, all these things we see. And I think they've done a very nice job of taking the world that was built in the comics and putting it on the screen in a way to where you're kind of like, okay, I want more. Let's see what happens next year. Kinsey and Tyler, one of them is going to be in their senior year soon, probably, because it seems like they might be a grade apart. It doesn't seem like they're twins by any means.
Yeah, it's very interesting because for me, I did read the graphic novels. I'm pretty sure I read all of them, but I can say that it did seem like they took all the novels and put it into the one season.
Okay.
So to your point, I'm actually very curious too as to like, is there going to be a second season? Because they kind of left it as like the possibility, right? But
Yeah.
then, yeah, I'm actually not sure what direction they're going to go in. It kind of feels like to me almost like a Game of Thrones situation where they covered all the books. So now it's like, okay, now what? Are you going to release more or not? And I can totally be wrong here too, because it has been many years since I've like, checked in on like, is there anything new out there? Because, with the history of this TV show, actually,
It's crazy.
oh my gosh, like they just had like so many issues because issues, but it was, I believe they actually worked with Fox first
I
in
think so,
trying
yeah.
to create a pilot. Yeah, and I remember seeing it might be on YouTube somewhere like a quick trailer, and at the time I was like, oh great, they're finally gonna like adapt this to TV, and then I never heard anything about it after that. And then it's just like within recent years, I think it was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, like there was like rumors that Hulu was gonna pick it up, but then they dropped it. So it's like as a fan, I was just like waiting and hoping. And then when I heard Netflix, I'm like, oh my gosh, is it finally happening? So going into watching the initial first season, I had no idea they were gonna chop up the story. But considering that they basically took all the graphic novels, or like the editions, like
Uh-huh.
and threw it into one full season, it was, yeah. I'm very curious as to like what the next steps are. So I guess we have a little bit of homework to do after this.
Yeah, and I mean, if it does end up being just this season, I think it was good. And there are certain things where sometimes they step away from the book, like Big Little Lies did this recently. The first season covered the book in its entirety, and then they came back for a
Mhm.
second season that expanded on it because the creator was involved. So, because Joe Hill is very much involved with the show, I have a different kind of confidence than, if the creator wasn't going to be involved, because there's also the option that, Joe Hill and Gabriel Rodriguez could create more comics. I don't think there's any rules saying they
Yeah.
can't do something different and end up writing more comics. But because of the release schedule of comics and how quickly Netflix would likely want to do a second season, like you said, we definitely have some homework to do, because there are so many moving pieces, not only in creating a comic, but then having it adapted for television, especially if the creators are involved. So it's one of those things where I'm like, I'm happy this finally came out. I'm very happy it finally came out, because it was a long time coming, and I am currently feeling the same way about the Why the Last Man adaptation that has been in turmoil
Yeah.
for so long. I'm just like, is it happening?
Oh
Is
my
it
gosh.
not? I would really love to see it, but I will take whatever I can get. So if one season is it, that's fine by me. But I know we've mentioned all of the different keys and the characters. So I want to ask you, are there any moments that really stood out to you in this as favorite moments, or just visually stunning moments?
No, that's a really great question. I think for me, the moments that really spoke to me were just, again, like just a little small metaphorical like details. Like one of the things I didn't really mention that I'll go back to was like, even when the mom, when she was stuck in that mirror maze, I really loved that all three kids were like we need to get her back. And in doing so, they put a rope and tied it around Tyler. And he went in trying to like grab her and like remove her or like take her back.
Yeah.
The whole thing of like working together and knowing that, at least for Tyler at that time, he was the one that was grounded. He was the one that was anchored on the other side. And he was able to find his mom through this maze and was able to pull her out. Like I think for me, um, as much as I love like the bright colors from like Bodhi's head and just like wow, like they did a great job of like for us to like jump into their minds and just like how beautiful it was. And to me, my favorite moments were just all the little things, those small details. And again, it's kind of like,
Hmm.
wow, you guys did a great job of pulling this out because again, you know, just if you skim through the graphic novels, like the line and artwork,
Yeah.
it just it's almost like so the colors are so muted and so moody, but
Uh-huh.
the line work and everything, the details that Gabriel Rodriguez like put in there, it's just so beautifully done. So I do suggest people to like look it up, or if you don't have the time to read it, just to look at the artwork itself and how it's portrayed in television, like a different medium. That's what I thought was just so beautiful in my mind.
Yeah, I really love the cave scenes too, because that
Yeah.
was when things kind of got a little darker and you were sort of feeling, this horror mood that, they were trying to set, and this mysterious unknown when they were going into these caves. And then when the kids are down there and the tide starts to rise, because it's taken them way longer to get to the spot that Kinsey was talking about than they anticipated. And, she's off looking at this blue glowing door, So she is putting the rest of them at risk because she has found sort of the crux of what these keys are for. And that's where you start to get this obsession of we need to know what's behind that door. And it just amazes me how well they made that door look like it was meant to be in those caves.
Yeah, you're right. I also feel like with her, because by that time her fear was gone, that was another thing too, where it's like, okay, even though you might not be scared or, you're living your life freely now, there's still consequences of you not dealing with things in a healthy way where your friends, the people that you care about could be affected by that, and it does portray that a little bit, like when they were going through the cave and like when the tides were coming in. So that was something else where, again, like for me, I love that with younger kids or millennials, they can watch that and just hopefully, it resonates with them of like how you can deal with things in a very healthy way.
Yeah, I also loved all of the scenes that were in the woods and the graveyard because it
Yes.
was like, even though with the head key you had these big surges of colorful scenery, you really still got that horror element when you were in the caves, when you were in the woods with these characters, especially when Kinsey's fear kept popping up too. You're like, oh, they nailed the look of that because it's her, but a much more terrifying version of her. And I love when Eden's like, you did this and that and blah, blah, blah. And then it attacks when Kinsey is there and it just freaks them all out on a whole different level.
Mm-hmm.
I also love the relationship with Rufus and Bodhi because even though Rufus is obviously so much older, him and Bodhi sort of have this similar playful mindset. And, Rufus is all into the G.I. Joes and soldiers and those action figures. And he really takes his job seriously, which, it seems like nobody else really has a job that they take seriously because you have Scott, who is a love interest for Kinsey, and he works at the ice cream shop, but he's never really working at the ice cream shop. He's there like twice the entire time, and otherwise he kind of just mentions it in passing. But it seems like because they are mostly all high school kids that we're interacting with, you have this element where it's like they're in this weird time period in their lives where they're kind of like, okay, we want to go out and we want to have fun. Like Tyler and his friends, they're all out partying. And then you have Kinsey, Scott, Gabe, and the rest of the crew just trying to make these little home movies because they actually love doing this, even if it sort of isolates them from what all of the other kids are doing in the outside world. So there's just this nice contrast between these little friend groups that we get throughout the entire season.
Yeah, I really love Bodhi and Rufus's friendship. Like they're just so adorable how they're able to, they're both different, but they are able to connect on like common interests. And for Bodhi, I think that's so important for him to like find a friend that's outside. But it's interesting that he found a friend that's not within really his age group, right? Like the little one who the kids are not taking seriously befriends a guy that is pretty serious. Like I think it's so funny to me.
Yeah, and you can tell that Bodhi feels comfortable with Rufus because he feels like Rufus understands him on a different level that even his own siblings aren't really totally connecting with him on.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, all around, I thought the character work done in this was great. Visually, it looked good. You have some hiccups in the story here and there, like you have the brother Duncan.
Oh, Duncan. Yes, Duncan.
So you have Duncan who kind of comes and goes, and I believe he's more based in Boston, which is why he's not there all the time, but he also forgets, like the mom does, about all of the magic. He forgets everything that happened, but because his memories were literally taken out of his head. He's a character I wanted to make sure we mentioned because of his history with the house. He's the only one other than Ellie who has a history with the house, and then we'd later find out that Lucas is Dodge, so there's a history there that is still very dark. There are still very dark moments in this show. I think they just do a nice job of surrounding them with some lighter moments to where it doesn't feel like if you watch all 10 episodes of this in a weekend or something, you're going to be exhausted by the end of it. You're still going to feel good by the end of it because of how it ends. But yeah, all around, I think they just did a nice job. I really enjoyed this. I know it got some mixed reviews from critics and stuff, but I was like, you know what? Give me all of the comic book adaptations. I am here for them.
Yes. Yeah, no, me totally. Because, when I watched it the first time around, I had that feeling too, like, oh man, like the comic book was so much darker. I wished at the time, I wished it was a little bit more true to it, like the mood and everything, because, it kind of made me think of like The Haunting of Hill House. I don't
Yes.
know if you've seen
Oh,
that,
yes. I love
but
it.
right, where it's just like, it's so like, it's scary, and after I watched through Lock and Key the first time and into the second time, I was like, you know what? I'm actually okay with this. Like I'm okay with them not taking every single thing from the comic book, because I believe, if my memory serves me correct, within the first few pages of the first issue, when the father did get murdered, I believe his wife, the mom, got raped as well, like in the comic book. So they made some hard choices, right? When they were trying to build a story for TV, especially when we're talking about like, mental health, trauma, and all sorts of stuff, that as a viewer, we're able to focus on one trauma that all four people within their family are going through, and they're going through it in different ways. They made a lot of hard choices when it came from adapting it, and
Hmm.
it just played out beautifully from a storytelling point of view, but also with the mood as well. Because with these four kids, like, you know, when you watch it, you don't want to also watch it and feel like, oh man, everything's doomed,
Yeah.
especially with like the balance of like the beautiful neon colors and all sorts of stuff when you're inside their heads, or just different moments. And then later on, you see like a darker scene, or like, as you mentioned, like the natural scenes of forest, the cemetery, being outdoors and everything. There's just a lot of different settings, and it's very contrasting, like you go from very something that's kind of like almost like beautifully serene to something that's like bright and like in your face. But that's
Yeah.
that's how life is, and story and people's lives, right? It's never just like one mood. It's like multiple things happening all at once. Like you can be really happy and cheerful, but you can also be like struggling and going through a lot of like dark, deep stuff. And I think the visuals and everything collectively, like they did a really great job. And I still, again, going back, like I love that we were able to see all these cameos, because, watching some of the recent Stephen King films, there's been, like Stephen King is like a cameo in, I don't want to spoil other things, but he'll pop up in like different movies.
Yeah. It's been a thing since like the 80s, so it shouldn't surprise anyone.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, that's fair. But like, so when we see Joe Hill, a part of me is like, oh, if Stephen King's the king of horror, then the prince of horror is like totally doing something that's like that his dad is doing, and that's
Yeah.
totally fun and so wonderful to see that, especially because it's like, I think about like the cameos with Stan Lee from like the Marvel universe. To me, I'm actually curious too if Joe Hill's universe will intersect more so with Stephen King, especially because they use the same kid actor from It, as you mentioned before, Georgie, right? So it's
Yeah.
like you see a lot of like crossovers. It's just very fun. It's just very fun to see both of them doing their thing, and for Joe to have his own version of his story, so it's not so identical to what his father's doing.
Right. I would also like to quickly give a shout out to Jackie for putting up with Tyler and his weird mood swings throughout this season, because he would go on like a total bender and just not care and not show up to stuff and disappoint her. And she was still there for him when everything that went down happened, because you see everyone bringing them all this food, and then you have the kids who come over and they're like, okay, we know you guys have been going through a lot, so we are here.
Mhm.
We're your friends. We're going to stick by you. And they go into the caves, and it's just nice to see that through all the ups and downs that the family is having, their new friends are willing to stick by them in the weirdest of circumstances.
Yeah. Well, not just with Tyler, right? Like it was also like Kinsey, like
Yes.
when she stood up Scott on their date, like she told him that she'll make it up to him and stuff like that. Like he didn't write her off right away.
And then she suggests dating both of them, him and Gabe.
I mean, when you have no fear, I guess you can be very bold there. Yeah. Well, yeah, I really appreciated that too, because also the way that Scott was treating her, like when he realized that the first time, when they were hanging out and she started to freak out a little bit, about, some memories that popped up in her mind, the way that he treated her, he wasn't like a white knight or anything like that. He was very sensitive to her and her emotions and feelings, but he still let her be in control.
Right.
And so I love that they showed that too, from both sides of like, yeah, how to be there for somebody in different ways, whether it's support or just being sensitive or just to be there to listen. So I really love that they showed that with both Kinsey and Tyler.
Yeah, well, I think we have covered a lot. I do want to talk about the keys a little more just because I feel like there were so many things going on with the keys. Did you find it hard to keep track of who had which key and what was going on and what key did what? Because there were quite a few keys. And so you're kind of like, okay, wait. The shadow key does this thing, and the anywhere key, that one's kind of self-explanatory. And then the matchstick key, that one is the one that is, letting you throw fire around. And so a lot of them were pretty self-explanatory, especially the head key, but I just like how they were incorporated into the story. It wasn't just like a game of hide and seek and find these keys. It's like, oh, these keys are going to determine how hard things are going to be for all of you.
Yeah. So for me, I was able to remember what key did what. Okay. But it was hard for me to keep track of like who had what at what time. Yeah, that part was actually a little tough for me. My memory wasn't so great. So even within the first episode, when we see like the matchstick key, a part of me was like, wait, what does this do? I don't understand. What does fire have to do with this kind of thing? Because, the varying degrees of each key, because the key there's a few keys where it's like, wow, this is really powerful stuff that in the wrong hands, like it could be complete chaos. But then there's other keys where I'm like, wait, I don't understand the purpose of this kind of thing. Which is, to me, that was the matchstick one. But then I guess it was like, okay, fire, things that I guess they were opposites too, right? Where it's like the matchstick key would like burn and destroy things, but then you have the one that repair things, or the cupboard when the mom was playing with that key. So I did like that they have like almost mirror images. There was moments of mirror images when it came to like the different keys. But, I am curious also because within the first episode, you see the father's friends having the matchstick key. But then later on, you start to notice that, oh, wow, like the dad actually owned a few of the keys that he had with him still. And that was when they were living in Seattle, I believe. And he was just giving them to the kids. But the rest of the keys were like strewn about in the house. So that's when I'm actually kind of curious as to like what happened there, like what happened back then? Like, did they just hide all the keys, or were they able to find it? Or the key also seems to have like a life of its own too, with all the whispering, like how they can like whisper and you can hear it to like find it. So like they all have their own personalities. So for me, I just wondered like what happened in the past after they brought back, was it like Dodge, like what happened there? Like where did all these keys, like did the father hide it throughout the house? Did he do it himself, or like did the keys disappear on its own? That was something I was actually wondering about. I don't remember if they explained that in the graphic novels. It's been quite a while since I read it or reread it again. But when I was watching it, that was one thing that I was wondering about, because as much as like, oh yeah, just what happened?
It seems like he dispersed about half of the keys, and then half were still in the house, because you have the one that was in Kinsey's bracelet. You have the one that went into the crown thing that was kind of hidden. So at least the crown was hidden a little better than the key seems to have been. And then you have the one that, like you said, the father's friend had when Ellie called, or the father called, and, he burned his house to the ground. Then you have Erin, who is in a home because she isn't speaking. She doesn't really seem to move much. And she knows these secrets of where the keys are, which is why Echo, Dodge, Lucas, whatever you want to call them, that's why that character keeps going back to see her. And the one thing that I didn't really entirely understand was the relationship with the boy who killed the father, and how they kept going back and visiting him and then finally letting him out. And he ended up with the matchstick key. And you're just like, there are so many moving parts to where these keys have been. It is hard to kind of keep track from, the past flashbacks that we see and understanding how those keys ended up where they ended up in the future.
Yeah. With the matchstick key, I believe there was a part, right, where Dodge she traveled, or it traveled to the friend's house, the house that was burned down, and she took it from a random kid that was exploring. So when she took it, I believe that was when she gave it to...
I forget his name too. the boy who killed the father.
Yes. So I think that one I followed along. But then when the three Locke children, when they split up their keys, it was hard for me to track that too.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that was tough for me. And it's also like the responsibility for all the kids. Like they became the new guardians of these keys and stuff too. So it's almost like history repeating itself.
And I mean, in the end, it didn't really entirely matter because they ended up with all of the keys anyway, from what I could tell.
Yeah.
They had to go get them all back, and Tyler had to, steal the one from Dodge, and then she couldn't get it back because he had it in his hand. And you're kind of just like, oh, okay. All right. They ended up with all of them in the end. So how we got there, even if it's a little muddy, it's okay.
Yeah.
Well, do you have any final thoughts about the show? I think we've talked about it as much as our memories will allow here.
Yeah. I just think it was like well done. Like I wasn't so sure about it. I was very nervous going into the first season just because I love the graphic novel so much. But like as we have discussed, I think at the end of it, they did a very great job. And I'm just very excited to see what comes after all of this.
Same.
What's in store, if there is going to be a second season or not. And congratulations to both Joe and Gabriel, especially with just the history of this coming to television. It took so many years, but I'm glad that it just worked out well in the end and that we finally have it.
Absolutely. Well, Jen, thank you so much for coming on to talk about this today.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. And quickly before we go, I want to let you all know how you can support the podcast. You can sign up for our Patreon for $1 a month. That'll get you a thank you on the show. $2 a month will get you the chance to pick a topic for me and a guest to talk about. For $5 a month, you can join the Welcome to Geekdom Slack group. You can also rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you prefer. And you can follow us on socials at Geekdom Pod on Twitter and at Welcome to Geekdom on Instagram and Facebook. As always, thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoy the rest of your day.